everybody. So today's episode of the Michigan Makers podcast has a very cool guest. Her name is Jessica Robinson. She is of Ford Smart Mobility, and she's the director at City Solutions there. Now, before we get into today's episode, I actually forgot to turn on the camera when we first started. So the very first question, her story question, I didn't actually get. So, sorry. But the entire interview's there anyway, other than that one question. So, yeah, I hope you enjoy.
All right. Okay. All right. We're back. Okay. So that was your story. So let's talk about your time in San Francisco. So you worked for Zipcar, doing a variety of different things. So what was that time like, being in the Bay Area and also the work you did with Zipcar?
Mm-hmm. So it was actually a crazy time to be in the Bay Area. This was when Facebook was really starting to pop. Twitter was kicking off. Square had just launched. So there was a lot of hubbub and activity around social networking apps. But at the same time, there were a lot of mobility things popping up as well, some of the TNC services. But I was there for Zipcar, and as a car sharing company, one of the most important things that we did was put our vehicles in neighborhoods where people lived and worked. And so my job was to figure out what those places were and then negotiate parking in them. And for anyone who's ever lived in or been in San Francisco, you know how hard parking is to find. Yeah. So it was actually one of the coolest jobs I ever had, because the only way I was going to be successful is if I knew the neighborhoods that had a lot of activity going on, where people were moving to. But I had to get out on the street, pound the pavement to find some of those parking spots. And so, whether it was walking into a gas station with a dozen donuts to try and make a friend, or, working with the city for their on-street parking pilot, I got to really know the lay of the land well during that time.
Yeah, I find that incredibly fascinating, because something that pops in my head, like, what was the most, like, out there experiences you had, like, talking to someone to negotiate parking?
Oh yeah, there's so much negotiating. It's an area of business that I never thought I'd be in. It was actually really fascinating. There's one vendor in particular that I think of, and he was in a neighborhood. He owned a service station, and it was second or third generation service station in the city. But the neighborhood had changed so much that people actually didn't own cars in his neighborhood anymore. And so his business had declined and declined and declined. And walked in one day, caught him on a slow moment, and we started chatting. And at first it was about the city and what's going on, and eventually we got to business. But he ended up being one of our best vendors in one of our best locations. But it was only because we started out just on the personal level. But it was fascinating because you really got to see a changing city in real time through parking needs and how people got around, and they just didn't need to get their oil changed anymore because they weren't owning cars. Yeah,
especially in a city like San Francisco, and now we're seeing that, especially in New York, even where I live, Ann Arbor. Zipcar is so prevalent there because not everybody owns a car, like, especially the attraction of out-of-state students. Like, even if they do own cars, they're not necessarily driving them all the way from New Jersey, all the way from New York, all the way to Michigan. Yep. And letting it, especially since, parking passes are so expensive, because it's a university town.
Yes. Yeah. But, yeah. University students, international students as well.
Oh, yeah.
Doctors and nurses who were doing their advanced degrees and residencies. These are all people who, maybe that was the only choice they had at one time, but universities are investing in bus passes and other ways of getting around. So the idea of, figuring out how to buy a car in a country you're just moving to is actually pretty intimidating. So yeah, I was really excited to be part of offering a different kind of solution.
Yeah, definitely. And so I was, doing my digging as always, and I found that.
What did you find?
So someone once said about you that Jessica is contagiously driven and one of the most impressive people I've ever had the pleasure of working with.
Oh my goodness, who was that? That's amazing.
I can tell you later, but yeah, so that begs the question, at least for me, what drives Jessica Robinson?
Yeah. So what drives me is being part of finding a solution. And I've been really lucky throughout my career to be at companies that were at the forefront of making that happen. And the solution that I'm most passionate about, and it doesn't feel like work because it's just who I am, it's my life, is helping people move. And I really personally want to live in a world where access to mobility doesn't hold people back and doesn't limit their dreams. Certainly in Michigan, we know that getting around to jobs and school can hold people back. And here in my community, I want to be part of that, solving it. But particularly in my early days working in car sharing, what I really learned was how much money we spend on getting around as Americans, but also our homes. And so those two things combined for most Americans, about 40% of our income. So if you think about even having a couple $100 back a month, that's a big deal for most people. So I love the question of how new technology can improve people's lives, but very specifically in mobility because we spend so much money on it.
Yeah, and so, so Ford has Ford, and then Ford Smart Mobility is a different company. And the city solutions part of Ford is set up specifically to, and these are your words, to bring human-centered design to cities, understand how mayors and other elected officials are thinking about their cities, how public transit agencies are thinking about their futures, and how citizens are thinking about what we want the places we call home to look like, feel like, and be like in the future.
Yes.
So it sounds like what you do is sort of a mix of urban planning, civil engineering, transportation management, philosophical debate, et cetera. And so I really want to know, how much have you learned about the industry just from your career in it alone, both from your time at Zipcar and now at Ford?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I've definitely learned being here in Michigan as part of the auto industry is how good we are at scaling things. And I don't think I really appreciated that before until I was inside the walls of an OEM. And that's one of the things that excites me the most about the work that we're doing now is if we were at a startup, we could have a great idea, but we would be constantly out fundraising and really trying to get people to take our meetings. That's not a problem at Ford. Now, money doesn't grow on trees, but people, are interested to know what we're doing. So I really see that as a gift and an opportunity that we can't squander. But I also think, having been in the Bay Area, and even a little bit now when we talk about self-driving vehicles, being in a company that's always thought about innovation in the form of new products or product enhancements, sometimes it's easy to forget that innovation can look like other things as well, a new business model or a new customer segment or a new partner. And that's one of the things sometimes with my colleagues we have to remember and remind each other is, yes, technology advancements are important, but only if they add value, improve people's lives, and make things easier for them.
Yeah, and so when I interviewed somebody, so Amanda Roroff from Planet M, we talked about the concept of the public-private partnership and the value it brings to the innovation ecosystem. So my question is to you, what are the interactions like with your city partners? Are most city partners excited about the upcoming technologies?
Yeah, it's a really complex time to be doing what we're doing. There's a lot of excitement for sure. And one of the most interesting things I think is with the arrival of self-driving vehicles into cities, planners and elected officials in particular are really interested to understand what will these changes mean for them? What should they be thinking about in terms of road design or building design? Do they need to have parking minimums for their developments anymore? but they don't really know, because they're not in the rooms with the engineers, they don't really know what's real, what's hype, what the timing is, what it means for them. So I really love having those conversations with them to talk about what's real and what they should be thinking about. The other thing that I love, makes me a little crazy, is the fact that this is a new customer segment for Ford. We have a long-standing history of selling government fleet vehicles, but in terms of working with the government as a software partner or services partner or services customer even, we've never done that before. And so now we're talking about a big company like Ford doing new businesses and new services with a customer, government, procuring new businesses and services for the first time. That's not something that's really been done before. And, I think it's fair to say neither of the big company or the government are known for being innovative, nimble, or quick. So it makes for some really interesting conversations because the intention is there, and you just have to figure out how to actually work together to get the project done.
Yeah, I think, you summed it up pretty aptly in one of the articles I read, which is, the goal, being disruptive is nice and fine for startups, but the goal, especially for city planning and city solutions, is not to be disruptive. It's to work together with the current incumbents that are there and have the influence to actually drive the decision making that goes behind, designing the city of the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what's fascinating about this question of disruption is, again, in Silicon Valley, disruption has been a badge that people carry, and rightfully so, right? That's how markets have moved forward. But when you're talking about the places we call home, disruption may not actually be what we want, and we may not want our governments and people that are charged with running our city to go around and think about being disruptive in crazy ways too. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we can be stagnant or sit on the sidelines and not make decisions. And I think that's what we hear from our city partners and our transit agencies is, I recognize the world is changing again, and I'd really like to be part of shaping that future as the public sector, rather than just having the next phase of transformation be done to me again. And there's really fascinating conversations that are happening right now about how much land in cities is actually allocated to roads, and everyone's thinking about what we could do differently there. And I think it's amazing, certainly ironic, that I and my team members are having those conversations because the roads are there for traffic flow. And that's part of our business today.
Yeah. That brings up an image in my head of one of the videos I watched where it was sort of this animation of, a 8-lane highway, 2 ways, kind of transforming into, let's say, a 4-lane highway, 2 ways, and autonomous fleet going on one side, and in the middle are going to be like the bike shares, and then like up in like to the left of it all is like a light rail system or something like that. And I was like, that's actually really cool.
Yeah, and there's here in the U.S., we take a lot of our inspiration in this area from what they're doing in Europe and some of the Asian countries as well, and really rethinking what the quality of place is with the street, whether it's street vendors and music or just better walkways with trees that are, they feel more humane and human. And so I think we're catching up in that area here still, but whether it's Detroit or really any city in the U.S., they're all thinking about that right now, which is amazing.
Yeah, and so, I'm curious, how do you approach the implementation of city solutions and balance implementing technologies that are far ahead enough to not be made obsolete by future technologies? Do you get what I'm...
I do, yeah. We don't, certainly cities don't want to invest in something now that they're just going to have to replace. If you buy a Blu-ray player and now there's the next you're out a couple $100. But if a city invests in a certain traffic signal technology across 100 intersections, you want to make sure that that's going to be worth it for a while. So there's some caution there for sure on the infrastructure side. Pilot is a magic word in public-private partnerships because it lets you try things out without you don't have to go through maybe the same procurement processes, but the city doesn't have to commit to something that it doesn't know yet. So that's one of the things we're seeing more and more is cities, transit agencies, and others are thinking about flexible ways to learn about technology without spending a ton of their their taxpayer dollars in an investment. And so again, whether it's infrastructure or a project, they're looking at procurement models that because if you're a city and you're buying a new service that's never been deployed before, you don't really know what to ask for either. And so it's ways to get closer together to understand what the future is. And then the implementation, it depends on the service. If there are things like Chariot, which is microtransit and involves vehicles, we're looking for things like a garage to store them. We're hiring local drivers. If it's software, we're trying to figure out which of our developers should be allocated to the project and what the timeframes are to do design sprints. So it can vary pretty significantly.
Yeah, and it definitely does, matter depending on like the actual project because, let's take, for example, like if you have to do construction on streets, that's going to take a lot more time, a lot more taxpayer dollars versus, Chariot, where it's just like, okay, let's find a parking garage to store all of our vehicles.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things too in this theme around flexibility is the cities, the public transit agencies wanting to be more nimble, but potentially being hamstrung by the way things are done now. So depending on the city, bus routes may only be able to be updated monthly or even annually. They don't necessarily have real-time data through a software service that they could use, or even a service like Chariot, where you're getting more real-time demand in terms of understanding where the customers are. You can actually be more flexible, and that's one of the things that's important in all of these new mobility services as well, is what's the information input that helps improve the quality of the service.
Yeah, and something that popped up in my head right now is the question of, so comparing and contrasting the different modes of mobility and the whole industry within different cities. So obviously there's a way to tackle San Francisco's infrastructure, Washington, D.C.'s infrastructure, New York's infrastructure, Chicago, and especially Detroit. So what have you found to be, the unique part about Detroit, both from like the fact that we're just so early and we're not to the stage of, a transit system like New York or even DC, where, they have stuff like companies like Transit Screen, you have the Ford hub where you can see not just, trains and buses and those public routes, but you can also see Lyfts and Ubers and the nearest bike share, et cetera.
So I'll start with the commonalities, because for as different as cities are, there are actually some things that are the same. So, mega trends, people are moving to cities, we're getting older, costs of housing are getting more expensive. That holds pretty much everywhere, including Detroit. And what that's driving is revisiting land use, funding public transit, and questions about parking minimums and affordable housing costs. So kind of universals there. Some differences are certainly the quality of public transit as it exists. The funding is a big piece of that too. Topographically, do you have hills? Do you have water? Do you have rivers? In Pittsburgh, they have to also maintain stairways in the sides of the hills. We don't have that here in Detroit. But to this city specifically, one of the things that I think is fascinating, because we're home to the auto, is we have an amazing network of surface roads, and we have freeways. And if you're a driver, most of us hop on and off of those freeways all day, every day. As bicyclists, one of the things that's really cool is some of our main surface roads are 4 lanes wide, 8 lanes wide in some cases, which is kind of crazy. So as long as we stay to the speed limit that's posted, it actually is a pretty enjoyable bicycling ride or walk. And so we already have a lot of space allocated to movement. And so what I'm excited about is how can we repurpose some of that space for different kinds of movement, because unlike Barcelona or New York or Paris, where the buildings are already right up against the sidewalk and the roads, we've still got some space in there. So that's, I think, one of the things that we have that's special here.
Yeah, and so, Ford Smart Mobility released at CES this past year a transportation mobility cloud, which is, for the listeners, an urban operating system that will help coordinate the many devices, vehicles, and individual passengers in smart cities. So that's where, Ford data can be shared, other auto manufacturers' data can be shared, bike sharing companies' data can be shared, etc. And, that to me is incredibly refreshing because, Ford, as a large Fortune 500 company, is opening up their data to possible competitors in the spirit of collaboration. And that is really impressive to see, a company as large as Ford open and essentially share their notebooks with everybody else.
Yep. Yeah, and the openness and the collaboration is actually a hallmark of our approach. I think it's right aligned with taking a partner approach versus a disruptive approach. We could pretend that we're going to solve this all and have one platform to rule everything. But the reality is we're not the only players in this space, and the solutions will actually be better for the fact that multiple people and entities are involved. And one of the remarkable things about data in cities right now is that a lot of agencies and public offices have invested in open data programs or even moving their data storage to the cloud. But they've done so, they've worked with other vendors to get that set up. And so when we have conversations to say, hey, we'd like to talk to you about bringing this into a platform or opening it up, they're really excited. And then we start to kind of peel back the layers and get into the weeds, and they realize that they don't even actually have the visibility into the raw data that they thought they did. The field names are encoded in a weird way, or they don't even have the tech talent to be able to download and open the files and move them and whatever. So we really think that it will probably take longer to do it this way, but it actually will make for a better and smarter foundation for services to be built on top of. Connecting our vehicles is a big part of the future for Ford. So all of our new vehicles will launch with modems to enable that data collection and data sharing. But again, that's only one piece of it. When you think about a transportation mobility cloud, it's all of the smart infrastructure that's out there, whether public or private, but again, all the rich city data that's there. And the real value is going to be what you do with it once it's all in one place.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think I liken it to essentially open sourcing the city of the future, right? And so that term alone, open source, has been, a staple of open collaboration. And so what do you think, how can we apply this similar concept? Obviously there's open source, a lot of things, but how can we have more, what we call collaborative innovation like that in other industries?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm personally increasingly interested in is the role and the timing of standards in moving platforms and technologies forward. So I used Blu-ray earlier as an example. The classic thing people talk about is Betamax versus VHS. You had these two competing standards, different vendors were pitching. at the end of the day, what won was VHS had better content. It wasn't about the underlying technology. But what would have happened if they had agreed earlier to share on the standard and then compete on content? Betamax could have won. We could, they would just be two, movie houses now rather than one's an obsolete technology. The standardization is very much true now. You think about electrification of vehicles, but you also think about, in my world, some of the new data sets that we're collecting. And if we take some steps now, just even as industry, to lead in this area, can we speed the adoption and the proliferation of things that actually will improve cities?
Yeah, and so before I wrap up here and ask the last question, where can people find more information on Jessica Robinson? Where can people find more information about Ford Smart Mobility and check out all the neat stuff that y'all are up to?
Yes, so Medium, there's constantly updates and posts about city solutions.
Yes, I see Jim Hackett posts a lot.
I know, he does, which is really cool. So Medium, there's always new content there, whether it's Ford or Ford Smart Mobility. I'm personally super active on LinkedIn. You can occasionally find me on Twitter, certainly on Instagram. And then the other place that I would keep an eye out is the Ford City of Tomorrow Symposium. There's some really good videos and content there from our program last year in San Francisco. And it was the first time we had ever done it as a company, but we really brought together thought leaders that hadn't really been in public conversations before. So there'll be more to come on that.
Awesome. So last question here. This podcast is releasing during the month of mobility, at least where we deem it. And so I'm asking this question to all of my guests. So for Jessica Robinson, what does mobility mean to you?
Mobility means to me community. And I think why that's important is it's only when we move around are we exposed to new ideas, new experiences, meeting our neighbors. And so in the month of mobility in Detroit, hopefully it stops snowing and we can actually get out and walk and maybe go see a new band or restaurant or walk over and say hi to our neighbor that we haven't seen all winter. And I think that movement is actually linked to community. So for me, that's what mobility is all about.
Awesome. And with that, I want to thank you so much for coming on. This was a great conversation.
I was glad to be here. Thank you so much.
All right, everybody, that was Jessica Robinson from Ford Smart Mobility. I'm really excited to see what Ford does, especially since they're rebranding from not an automotive company anymore to a mobility company. Really interesting. I hope them the best. But if you liked that video, if you liked that interview, please let me know in the comments below or to the side or wherever you're watching works. And also subscribe or like our page if you want to see more content. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.